The crash was violent, leaving Drew half-conscious in the mangled cockpit of his shuttle. Sparks erupted from control panels, illuminating the confined space in stuttering flashes of light. The ship groaned, metal buckling under its own weight as the engine sputtered one final time. Drew, coughing against the acrid smoke filling the cabin, struggled to release his harness. His fingers trembled as he yanked the lever, the straps snapping loose with a jolt. Pain flared in his side, a cracked rib, maybe more, but survival instincts overrode everything else. He grabbed his emergency pack, slinging it over his shoulder as he stumbled to the exit. The hatch jammed, its mechanism hissing in protest, but Drew shoved it open with the last reserves of his strength. Cool, damp air rushed in as he fell forward, landing hard on unfamiliar ground. For a moment he simply lay there, blinking up at the sky, which pulsed with soft hues of lavender and amber. Strange twin suns hovered on the horizon, casting long shadows across a landscape unlike anything Drew had ever seen. The ground beneath him wasn't dirt but something soft and pliant like moss, yet it shimmered faintly as he moved. Around him, enormous trees stretched toward the heavens, their trunks translucent and glowing softly, as if they carried rivers of light within them. Leaves as broad as sails shimmered in colors that shifted with every subtle breeze. Pools of liquid light dotted the forest floor, their surfaces rippling with unnatural hues. Drew pushed himself up, wincing at the sharp pain in his side. He looked back at his shuttle, half buried in the spongy terrain, smoke still curling from its hull. The ship wasn't going anywhere. He didn't need to check the damage to know that much. How did it come to this? He muttered under his breath. The mission had been routine. He was part of an exploratory fleet sent to chart the farthest edges of the known galaxy, identifying planets that could potentially support human colonization. His ship had been knocked off course by an unexpected solar flare, and the resulting system's failure left him plummeting toward this uncharted world. There had been no time to send a distress signal. For all Drew knew, he was alone, utterly abandoned on an alien planet. Alone. The thought hit him harder than he'd expected, tightening his chest. He shook it off and focused on the immediate problem: survival. Shelter came first, then water, food, and a plan to fix or at least signal from his wrecked ship. As Drew scanned his surroundings, he noticed a cliff face rising beyond the forest. Its jagged surface was broken by what looked like a dark opening, a cave. It was as good a place as any to start. Gripping his emergency pack tightly, he set off, his boots squelching against the glowing ground. The forest was eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no animal cries, just the faint hum of the planet itself, a low, steady vibration that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet. It made his skin crawl. He adjusted the strap of his pack, trying to ignore the prickling sensation along his neck. Halfway to the cliff, a sound broke the stillness. A faint, rhythmic whimper. Drew froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife strapped to his leg. The sound came again, soft and halting, like the cry of a wounded animal. It wasn't an animal, though. It was a voice. Oh. Heart pounding, Drew turned toward the source of the noise. It was coming from the cave. He approached cautiously, slipping behind a cluster of bioluminescent plants at the entrance. The sound grew clearer as he neared a mix of whispers and faint sobs. He pushed aside the glowing foliage and peered inside. The cavern was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its walls glistened with what looked like liquid light, casting a soft, shifting glow across the space. In the center of the cave sat a figure, a woman, cradling 2 children in her arms. Their blue skin glistened faintly in the dim light, and their long golden hair shimmered like spun sunlight. Drew's breath caught. The woman's features were humanoid but otherworldly. Her large, almond-shaped eyes glowed faintly, and her slender frame was marked by faint, iridescent patterns along her skin. She was visibly weak, trembling, as she held the children close. The little ones, both girls, clung to her, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and fear. The woman's eyes snapped to Drew, and she stiffened, holding the children tighter. She hissed something in a sharp, lilting language he didn't understand. Her tone was defensive, almost feral. "Hey," Drew said, raising his hand slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." One of the girls, the smaller of the 2, turned her wide eyes toward him. Her voice was soft but clear. "Are you one of them?" Drew frowned. "One of who?" The mother hissed again, silencing the child. Her gaze remained fixed on Drew, her body coiled like a spring, ready to defend her daughters at any cost. "I don't know who you think I am," Drew said carefully, "but I'm just a guy who crash-landed here. I don't even know what this place is." The older girl leaned closer to her mother, whispering, "He doesn't glow like they do, Mother." The mother's grip on her children loosened slightly, but her expression remained wary. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her words accented but understandable. "An accident," Drew said. "My ship went down. I didn't mean to come here and I don't want trouble. I just need shelter." He gestured toward the cave. "You need help. I can see that. Let me help you." The woman hesitated. Her eyes flicked to her daughters, then back to Drew. "If you harm them." "I won't," Drew said firmly. The younger girl, still watching him intently, spoke again. "Do you know how to fix ships? Mother's ship is broken." "Lyra," the woman said sharply, "enough." Drew glanced between them, piecing together fragments of the situation. They were stranded just like him. The mother's exhaustion, the children's frailty, the makeshift bedding of glowing moss in the corner, it all pointed to weeks, maybe months, of struggle. He crouched slowly, setting his pack on the ground. "I'll stay back," he said, "but I can give you food and water. It's safe." The woman studied him for a long moment, then gave a reluctant nod. Drew unpacked a few energy bars and his water filter, sliding them across the ground. She took them cautiously, her hands trembling. The children watched with wide, unblinking eyes. As they ate, Drew stayed quiet, letting them grow accustomed to his presence. He caught the older girl, Lyra, sneaking glances at him. The younger one, who hadn't spoken yet, clung to her mother but seemed less frightened now. "What's your name?" Lyra asked suddenly. "Drew," he said. "And you?" She hesitated, then said Lyra. "My sister's Kala. Mother is Taela." Taela shot her daughter a reproachful look but didn't scold her. Instead, she turned her attention back to Drew. "If you stay," she said slowly, "you must understand. This place is not safe." Drew nodded. "I gathered that." Taela's eyes darkened. "There are others. Not like you. Not like us. They hunt." We felt a chill creep up his spine. He didn't know who or what these hunters were, but he had a feeling he'd find out soon enough. For now, though, survival came first. Whatever this family had been through, he was determined to help them. And maybe, in helping them, he could save himself too. Drew sat cross-legged on the cool, spongy ground just inside the cave, sharpening his knife against a smooth, obsidian stone he'd found near the stream. His muscles ached from the crash, his ribs throbbed with each breath, but he ignored the discomfort. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone grounded him, helping to quiet the questions racing through his mind. Behind him, the soft rustle of movement caught his attention. Lyra and Kala peeked around their mother, who remained seated against the far wall. Taela's watchful eyes never left him, her posture still tense despite her children's growing curiosity. "You're fixing your weapon," Lyra said suddenly, stepping forward a little. Her golden hair shimmered faintly in the low light of the cave. "Why?" "It's not just a weapon," Drew replied, holding up the blade. "It's a tool. You can cut wood, prepare food, or defend yourself with it." Lyra tilted her head, intrigued. "Our people don't use tools like that. We shape things." She waved a small hand, mimicking emotion, and her eyes glimmered faintly, as if recalling something lost. Taela spoke sharply, her voice a low, lilting reprimand. "Enough, Lyra. Let him work." Lyra frowned but stepped back reluctantly. Kala, quieter and more reserved, clung to her sister's arm. Drew caught the fleeting expression of disappointment on her small blue face. "They're curious," Drew said, glancing at Taela. "I get it. This is as strange to them as all of this is to me." "You carry danger with you," Taela replied evenly. "They should not be curious." "I'd rather they understand than fear," he countered, his tone calm but firm. "Fear makes mistakes." Taela narrowed her eyes, clearly skeptical, but she said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Drew took a breath and decided to break it. "Why are you hiding here?" he asked, turning the blade in his hands as if the question were casual. "You said there are hunters. What are they?" "Animals, other beings, something else." Taela hesitated, her gaze flicking to her daughters. Lyra and Kala both looked up at her expectantly, as if waiting for permission to speak. "They are machines," Taela said finally. Her voice wavered, but she steadied it quickly. "Remnants of war. They were built to destroy, but now they hunt anything that glows. Our light draws them." "Machines," Drew repeated, his brow furrowing. "Autonomous?" They were designed to follow commands, Tala explained. But the ones here are broken. Their purpose is corrupted. They sense life as an enemy. We are prey to them. Drew absorbed this, his mind spinning with possibilities, war remnants, sentient machines. A planet where glowing beings like Talea and her daughters were seen as targets. It explained the cave and the careful way she moved, always staying close to the shadows. Why not leave the cave, he asked. Find a safer place? Tiala gave a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and startling in the quiet. There is no safe place. The forest hides us, but the light of the stars above will betray us if we go too far. Drew leaned back, considering her words. It made sense now why she was so guarded, why her daughters had seemed so frail. They were prisoners in their own home, hunted by creations meant for war. Lyra broke the heavy silence, her voice soft. Do humans have wars too? The question caught Drew off guard. He paused, the knife slipping slightly in his grip. Yes, he admitted after a moment. More than I'd like to say. Do you fight in them? She asked, her wide, glowing eyes fixed on him. Drew hesitated, then shook his head. I study, explore, try to understand things. But I've seen war. It leaves scars no one can heal. Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line and she looked away. Kala reached for her hand, clasping it tightly. The quiet gesture made Drew's chest ache in a way he didn't expect. You came here to study, Taylor said suddenly, her voice cold. And now you're stranded. Do you intend to use us for your studies too? Her words hit like a slap. Drew set the knife and stone aside, meeting her gaze. I'm not here to hurt anyone, Taylor. I didn't choose to crash on this planet, but now that I'm here, I'll do whatever I can to help. Her expression remained skeptical, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. We'll see, she said. Words mean little. I'll prove it, then, Drew replied. The conversation ended there, but Drew's mind kept turning long after. Machines that hunted light. A mother and her children forced into hiding, and his own broken ship, now useless except as a marker of his failure. He stood and slung his pack over his shoulder. I'm going to find water, he said, his voice steady. You'll need more than what you have here. Taylor raised an eyebrow. You think it's that simple? I'll find a way, he said, stepping toward the entrance. Stay here. You'll draw them, she warned. The machines. I'll keep to the shadows, he said, glancing back at her. And I'm not glowing, remember? Lyra smiled faintly at that, but Talea's expression remained wary. She said nothing as he slipped out of the cave, disappearing into the luminous forest. The forest was alive in a way Drew had never seen before. The ground pulsed faintly under his boots, and the air felt charged, as if the planet itself was alive. He moved carefully, avoiding the larger pools of glowing liquid and sticking close to the thicker trees. He found the stream not far from the cave, its water crystal clear and cool to the touch. Drew crouched, filling his filter and watching the forest for movement. His instincts told him he wasn't alone, though he hadn't seen anything yet. The hum came first, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. Drew froze, his hand going to his knife. From the shadows of the trees, something emerged. A sleek, metallic shape, its body segmented like an insect's but moving with the precision of a machine. Its head swiveled, and Drew saw its glowing red eyes scanning the forest. He held his breath, pressing himself against the base of a tree. The machine moved closer, its footsteps surprisingly quiet for something so large. It paused at the edge of the stream, lowering its head as if sniffing the air. Then it turned sharply, red eyes locking onto the path Drew had taken. His heart raced as the machine began moving toward the cave. Drew ran. He kept low, his boots barely making a sound as he darted between trees. His mind raced. If the machine reached the cave, Taylor and the girls didn't stand a chance. He reached the cave just ahead of it, sliding inside and grabbing the largest rock he could lift. Taylor's eyes widened as he gestured for her to stay quiet. What? Machine, he whispered harshly. It's coming. She pulled the girls to her, her body shielding them as Drew positioned himself at the entrance. The hum grew louder, vibrating the air. Drew gripped the rock tightly, his jaw clenched. The machine's metallic body appeared at the entrance, its red eyes scanning the cave. Drew hurled the rock with all his strength, hitting it square in the head. The machine recoiled, sparks flying, but it didn't retreat. Back, Drew shouted, grabbing another rock. The machine lunged, and Drew swung with everything he had. The impact sent vibrations up his arms, but the machine staggered, its movements jerky now. Taylor stood then, her voice cutting through the chaos. Enough. Come inside. Drew barely had time to register her words before a soft glow spread from her hands, enveloping the cave. The machine froze, its body trembling before it collapsed, lifeless. Drew stared, breathing hard. What was that? Taylor's glow faded, her expression unreadable. A reminder, she said softly. Not everything is as it seems. He sank to the ground, his mind reeling. There was more to this family and this planet than he'd realized. The cave was silent except for the occasional drip of water from the luminous moss lining its walls. Drew leaned against the rocky entrance, the knife in his hand catching faint glimmers of light. His body ached from days of vigilance and labor, but it was the unrelenting tension that wore him down the most. Outside, the forest pulsed faintly, its bioluminescent glow creating an eerie twilight that never truly faded. It was beautiful, but beauty on this planet always came with a price. Taylor sat by the girls, her golden hair catching the soft light like strands of molten metal. Lyra and Kala huddled close to her, their faintly glowing skin illuminating the moss beneath them. Drew could feel Tyla's gaze on him, sharp and distrustful, even as she gently stroked Kala's head to soothe the child. They're asleep, Tala murmured after a while, her voice low and melodic. Finally. Drew turned, his eyes meeting hers. They're tougher than you give them credit for. They shouldn't have to be, she replied, her tone heavy with regret. Children are not meant for this life. Drew crouched down, resting his arms on his knees. You've kept them alive. That's more than most could do in your position. Taylor's lips pressed into a thin line. Barely. Every day is borrowed time, and when the machines find us. They won't, Drew cut in, his voice firm. Not if we're ready. Taylor scoffed, her distrust palpable. Your snares and stones, they won't stop what's coming. They'll buy us time, Drew said, his jaw tightening. Time to come up with something better. Time to figure out what those things want and how to keep them away. Her silence felt like an unspoken challenge. Drew stood, running a hand through his hair, and turned toward the forest. I'll check the perimeter. Make sure the traps are holding. You're wasting your energy, she said, but there was no venom in her tone this time. Just weariness. So. Maybe, he replied, stepping out into the glowing forest, but it's better than waiting to die. The traps were crude but effective. Drew had spent hours with Lyra, weaving vines and sharpening stones into rudimentary snares and spikes. The first few traps, near the stream, were intact. He crouched by one of the snares, tightening the knots and testing the tension. Satisfied, he moved deeper into the forest, his senses sharp for any sign of movement. The hum started faintly, so low it was almost imperceptible. Drew froze, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. The sound grew louder, vibrating in his chest like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. He turned toward the noise, his eyes scanning the glowing foliage. A red light flickered between the trees, moving with unnatural precision. Drew's heart pounded as the light drew closer, accompanied by the whirring of servos and the sharp clicks of metal limbs. He ducked behind a large glowing tree, holding his breath as the machine came into view. It was smaller than the last one, its insect-like body sleek and angular. Its head swiveled, scanning the area with an unsettling red eye. Drew watched as it approached one of the snares, its spindly legs moving with eerie fluidity. The trap snapped, the vine tightening around its limb. The machine jerked back, a metallic screech cutting through the air. Drew didn't wait. He lunged from his hiding spot, his knife slamming into the machine's exposed joint. Sparks erupted as the blade struck, and the machine thrashed violently, its remaining legs clawing at the ground. Drew yanked the knife free and struck again, aiming for its head. The second blow sent it collapsing into a heap of twitching metal. He stepped back, breathing hard, and wiped the sweat from his brow. The machine's red eye flickered once before dimming completely. Drew crouched beside it, inspecting the intricate design. Its joints were worn, the plating scratched and dented. This one was older, less advanced, but still deadly. He pried a small, glowing cylinder from its chest, studying the faintly pulsating core. It was warm to the touch, its hum weaker now. "What the hell are you running on?" he muttered to himself, pocketing the core for later study. When Drew returned to the cave, Tyla was waiting at the entrance, her arms crossed. "You were gone too long," she said, her voice laced with both concern and irritation. "Ran into company," Drew replied, tossing the glowing core to her. She caught it instinctively, her eyes narrowing as she studied the object. "You killed another one," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "They're not invincible," Drew said, stepping past her into the cave, "but they're persistent." Lyra sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Drew killed one of the machines," Taylor said, holding up the core. "Another scout." Lyra's eyes widened. Did it see the cave? No, Drew assured her. The traps worked. Taylor's expression remained grim. "They'll keep coming. The more we destroy, the more they'll send. It's only a matter of time." "Then we need to stop waiting for them to find us," Drew said, his voice resolute. "We need to take the fight to them." Taylor stared at him, incredulous. "Are you mad? You want to attack them? With what? Your knife and your vines?" Drew held her gaze, unflinching. "We can't stay here forever. If we don't act, we're sitting ducks." Lyra stood, her small hands balled into fists. "I'll help," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "If Drew thinks we can fight, we should." Taylor rounded on her daughter. "You will do no such thing. You're a child, not a soldier." Lyra's glowing eyes burned with defiance. "I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being afraid." Taylor's expression faltered, her shoulders slumping. She turned back to Drew, her voice quieter. "And what happens when you fail? When more machines come, angrier than before?" Drew stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then we make sure they regret it. We fight smarter, not harder. We figure out their weaknesses, disrupt their systems, and make this place uninhabitable for them." Taylor sighed, her fingers tightening around the core. "You're reckless." "I'm alive," Drew said. "And so are you. Let's keep it that way." For the first time, Taylor didn't argue. Instead, she walked to the corner of the cave, where a small pile of scavenged parts lay. She picked up a curved metal shard, inspecting it thoughtfully. "If we're going to fight," she said, her voice softer now, "we'll need more than traps and knives. We'll need tools, weapons." Drew smiled faintly. "Then let's get to work." The night passed in tense preparation. Taylor dismantled the glowing core, studying its intricate design while Drew sharpened his knife and prepared more traps. Lyra and Calla watched quietly, their wide eyes reflecting the glow of the moss. For the first time since his arrival, Drew felt a flicker of hope. They were no longer just surviving. They were planning, fighting back. As the forest hummed faintly outside, Drew glanced at Taylor. "You're not as stubborn as you look." She smirked, the first hint of humor he'd seen from her. "And you're not as useless as I thought." Drew chuckled, turning back to his work. The shadows of the hunt still loomed, but for now they had a chance. And sometimes a chance was all you needed. Dawn arrived on the planet in muted shades of violet and amber, painting the bioluminescent forest with an otherworldly glow. Drew sat at the edge of the cave, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Beside him, Lyra crouched on her heels, her golden hair spilling over her shoulders as she worked on weaving another snare. Her small hands moved with surprising precision, her determination quiet but palpable. Behind them, Taylor tinkered with the salvage machine core. She had spread the parts across a flat rock, using a shard of metal as a makeshift tool to prod at the intricate wires and circuits. Her face was a mask of concentration, her glowing eyes narrowing every so often as she muttered to herself in her native tongue. Calla sat nearby, watching her mother with wide, curious eyes, her tiny hands resting in her lap. The silence was thick, charged with anticipation. Drew finally broke it. "Any luck with that thing?" he asked, nodding toward the dismantled core. Taylor didn't look up. "It's not a weapon," she said, her tone clipped. "It's a power source. The energy it holds is volatile, dangerous." "Dangerous is exactly what we need," Drew replied, setting the knife aside. "Can you use it against the machines?" Taylor paused, her fingers hovering over the core. "Perhaps. If I can manipulate the charge, it might overload their systems. But the energy is unstable. One wrong move, and it will destroy everything within a wide radius." Lyra perked up, her voice bright with curiosity, like an explosion. "Yes," Taylor said, glancing at her daughter, "and not the kind you would survive." Drew stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Then we use it as a last resort. Right now, we need to keep the machines off our backs long enough to figure out a real plan." Taylor's lips tightened, but she gave a curt nod. "I'll see what I can do." The morning passed in careful preparation. Drew led Lyra and Calla outside to reinforce the traps, teaching them how to hide the snares more effectively beneath the glowing foliage. Lyra's enthusiasm hadn't waned since the day before, but Kala was quieter, her small hands trembling as she worked. Drew crouched beside her, his voice low and reassuring. "You're doing fine, Kala," he said. "These traps could save us one day." Kala looked up at him, her wide, glowing eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if they don't work?" "They will," Drew said firmly. "And if they don't, we'll find another way. That's what surviving means. You keep trying no matter what." Kala nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the vine she was weaving. Lyra, watching from a few feet away, gave her sister an encouraging smile. "See, you're better at this than me," Lyra said, nudging her. "I'd just tie everything in knots." Kala giggled softly, the sound breaking the tension that had hung over them all morning. As the day wore on, Drew ventured deeper into the forest, hoping to find more materials to use for their defenses. The bioluminescent trees towered over him, their translucent trunks casting shifting patterns of light on the ground. He moved cautiously, his knife at the ready, his ears straining for any hint of the machine's telltale hum. The forest felt different today, quieter than usual. Drew couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. His grip tightened on the knife as he scanned the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he heard a faint rustling, too soft to be the machine's. He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement in the shadows. A creature emerged, unlike anything he'd seen before. It was small and quadrupedal, its body covered in shimmering scales that reflected the forest's glow. Its eyes, large and luminous, locked onto him with an intelligence that startled him. The creature didn't move closer. It stood there watching him with a strange mix of curiosity and caution. Drew lowered his knife slightly, his voice low and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, unsure if it could even understand him. The creature tilted its head, its scales rippling with color. It took a cautious step forward, then another, before stopping a few feet away. Drew noticed something strange, a small, jagged scar running along its side. It looked like a wound, perhaps from one of the machines. "Did they do that to you?" he asked softly. The creature didn't respond, but its gaze remained fixed on him. Drew slowly crouched, reaching into his pack to pull out a piece of dried food. He held it out, his movements deliberate. The creature hesitated, then took a step closer. Its nose twitched as it sniffed the air, and finally, it snatched the food from his hand with surprising delicacy. It chewed slowly, its glowing eyes never leaving his face. Drew smiled faintly. "Looks like we're both just trying to survive." The creature lingered for a moment before retreating into the shadows, its shimmering form vanishing among the glowing trees. Drew watched it go, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. If the forest held life beyond the machines, perhaps there was more to this planet than he'd realized. When Drew returned to the cave, Taylor was waiting for him, her arms crossed. "You were gone too long," she said, her voice sharp. "I found something," Drew replied, setting down his pack. A creature, small, covered in scales. Well, looked injured, like it had run into one of the machines. Taylor's expression shifted, her brows furrowing. The forest creatures do not often reveal themselves. They are cautious. "Smart," Drew said, pulling out the remaining supplies he'd gathered. "Smarter than us, maybe." Lyra ran up to him, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Did it glow?" she asked. "A little," Drew said, smiling. "Not as much as you do." Lyra giggled, but Taylor remained serious. "If the creatures are moving closer to us, it could mean the machines are driving them out of their territory. It is not a good sign." "Then we'll need to be ready," Drew said, his tone resolute. "How's the core coming?" Taylor gestured toward the rock where the dismantled parts still lay. "It's unstable, but I've created a trigger mechanism. If we plant it and lure the machines to it, it could disable several at once." "And if it goes wrong?" Drew asked. "Then we'll have bigger problems," Taylor said bluntly. Drew nodded, appreciating her honesty. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." That night, the hum returned, louder and more insistent than before. Drew stood at the entrance of the cave, his knife in hand, as Taylor and the girls huddled in the shadows behind him. The traps outside snapped one by one, followed by metallic screeches and the grinding of gears. Drew stepped out, his heart pounding. A larger machine loomed in the darkness, its red eyes scanning the forest with relentless precision. The traps had slowed it, but it kept moving, its body battered but functional. Now would be a good time for that core, Drew shouted over his shoulder. Taylor appeared at the entrance, holding the glowing core in her hands. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the girls, then to Drew. If I throw it, we have to run. Do it, Drew said, his voice steady. I'll cover you. Taylor hurled the core toward the machine, the glowing device landing with a faint hiss. The machine turned toward it, its red eyes narrowing. Drew grabbed a rock and hurled it at the machine, drawing its attention. Come on, he shouted, over here. The machine lunged toward him, its limbs moving with unnerving speed. Drew dodged, rolling to the side as the core began to pulse. Taylor pulled the girls farther into the cave, shielding them with her body. The core detonated, a blinding flash of light and heat that sent Drew sprawling. When the dust settled, the machine lay in pieces, its red eyes extinguished. Drew sat up slowly, coughing against the acrid smoke. Taylor emerged from the cave, her face pale but determined. We survived, she said. For now, Drew replied, pulling himself to his feet. But this isn't over. Taylor nodded, her gaze hardening. Then we fight smarter, together. Drew smiled faintly, the flicker of hope in his chest burning a little brighter. For the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting back. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Drew crouched low behind a tangle of bioluminescent vines, his pulse steady, despite the weight of anticipation. Before him loomed the ruins, a massive construct of jagged metal and ancient design. Crimson light pulsed from within, throwing fractured shadows across the surrounding terrain. The hum that emanated from the structure was deep and unrelenting, a constant reminder of the mechanical monstrosities that lay within. Beside him, Taylor knelt, her glowing eyes fixed on the structure. Her jaw was tight, and her hands rested on the scavenged tools they had fashioned into weapons. Lyra and Kala huddled further back, their golden hair catching faint glimmers of the crimson glow. Lyra held a bundle of vines tied into crude snares, her knuckles white as she clutched them. Kala clung to her sister's arm, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and determination. This is madness, Taylor whispered, her voice taut. We don't even know what's inside. We know enough, Drew replied, his tone calm but firm. This is where they repair, regroup. If we destroy it, we cripple them. Taylor shook her head. Or we provoke them, if the machines find us here. They already know we're a threat, Drew interrupted, adjusting the pack on his shoulders. This is our chance to stop waiting and start fighting back. Lyra crawled closer, her small voice breaking the tension. If we destroy it, will they stop hunting us? Drew glanced at her, his expression softening. Maybe not all of them, but it'll make it harder for them to keep coming. It'll buy us time. Taylor exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between frustration and resignation. Then let's get this over with. The approach was slow and deliberate. The ruins were surrounded by jagged remnants of the machine's previous incursions, broken limbs, charred plating, and fragments of circuits scattered like macabre breadcrumbs. Drew led the group, his movements precise as he avoided the exposed patches of metal that would betray their footsteps. Every sound seemed amplified, from the faint rustle of vines underfoot to the quiet hum of their breaths. As they neared the entrance, Drew signaled for the group to stop. He pointed to a machine guarding the doorway, its massive form bristling with weaponry. Unlike the smaller scouts they had encountered, this one moved with calculated precision, its red eyes scanning the surroundings in wide arcs. We can't take that head-on, Drew murmured, glancing at Taylor. We need a distraction. Taylor's gaze shifted to Lyra, who held the small, improvised noisemaker Drew had crafted. Without a word, the girl stepped forward, her hands trembling but steady. Drew reached out, stopping her. You sure about this? He asked. Lyra nodded, her chin lifting defiantly. I can do it. Drew hesitated, then released her. Toss it far, and as soon as it moves, get back here. Lyra crept to the edge of the foliage, the device cradled in her hands. With a swift motion, she hurled it into the distance. It clattered against the debris, emitting a shrill, piercing tone that echoed through the clearing. The machine froze, its head snapping toward the sound. With a series of sharp clicks, it turned and stalked toward the noise, its red eyes narrowing. Lyra scrambled back to the group, her breath ragged as she ducked behind the vines. Drew motioned for them to move, now. Inside the ruins, the air was thick and oppressive, carrying the acrid scent of oil and decay. The walls were lined with conduits pulsing with red light, their energy casting flickering shadows across the narrow corridors. The hum here was louder, vibrating through the floor with a relentless rhythm. The group moved in silence, their footsteps muffled against the metal grating. Drew took the lead, his knife drawn, while Taylor watched their flank. Lyra and Kala stayed close, their eyes darting nervously at every sound. The first chamber they entered was vast, filled with rows of dormant machines. Their sleek, insect-like bodies were lined up in perfect symmetry, each one connected to a glowing conduit by a tangle of wires. Drew's stomach tightened at the sight. "This is how they grow their army," he said, his voice low. "They're building more." Taylor's expression darkened, not for long. They moved quickly, navigating the labyrinthine corridors until they reached the core of the structure. The room was dominated by a massive terminal, its surface covered in glowing symbols that pulsed erratically. Energy surged through the conduits, converging on a central node that throbbed with power. "This is it," Drew said, setting his pack down. He began pulling out the salvage components and tools they had gathered. "If we overload this node, it'll trigger a chain reaction. The whole place will go up." Taylor knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the edges of the terminal. "It's unstable. If you make one mistake—" "I won't," Drew said, his tone firm. "Just keep watch." The hum grew louder as Drew worked, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Sweat dripped down his brow as he connected wires, each spark of energy a reminder of how little room there was for error. Taylor stood guard at the entrance, her glowing eyes scanning the corridor for signs of movement. Lyra and Kala huddled nearby, their small hands clutching each other tightly. Kala's voice broke the silence, a soft whisper that barely carried. "What if the machines come back?" "They will," Taylor said, her voice steady. "But we'll be ready." The words were meant to reassure, but even Taylor seemed unconvinced. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching longer than the last. Suddenly, the hum shifted, its tone rising to a piercing whine. Taylor turned sharply, her body tense. "They're coming." Drew glanced over his shoulder, his expression grim. "Just a little longer." The first machine burst into the room, its red eyes blazing. Taylor reacted instantly, her body glowing as she raised her hands. A surge of light erupted from her palms, striking the machine and sending it crashing into the wall. "More are coming," she shouted, her voice taut with urgency. Drew connected the final wire, the node sparking violently as energy surged through it. "It's done," he said, grabbing the detonator. "We need to move. Now." The group sprinted through the corridors, the hum rising to a deafening roar behind them. Machines emerged from every corner, their movements frantic as they tried to stop the intruders. Taylor unleashed bursts of light, her attacks precise but draining. Drew used his knife to fend off the smaller machines, his strikes quick and efficient. As they neared the exit, a massive machine blocked their path, its bulk filling the corridor. Drew didn't hesitate. He shoved the detonator into Taylor's hands, his voice urgent. "Take the girls and go," he said. "I'll hold it off." "No," Taylor said, her voice breaking. "You'll die." "Just go," Drew insisted. "You have to protect them." Taylor hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. Then she nodded, her jaw tightening. "Don't take too long." She ushered the girls past the machine, her light creating a shield that deflected its attacks. Drew stayed behind, his knife raised, his body coiled with resolve. The detonator's timer ticked down as Drew fought, his movements a blur of desperation and precision. When the final second passed, he threw himself toward the exit, the explosion erupting behind him in a blinding flash of light and heat. Outside, the ruins collapsed in a cascade of fire and metal, the crimson glow extinguished. Taylor and the girls stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces streaked with soot and tears. Drew emerged from the wreckage, his body battered but alive. Lyra and Kala ran to him, their small arms wrapping around him tightly. "You did it," Taylor said, her voice soft but filled with awe. "For now," Drew replied, his voice hoarse. "But this isn't over." Taylor placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression steady. "Then we'll fight. Together." Drew nodded, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion. The ruins lay in smoldering ruin behind them, a testament to their first victory. It wasn't the end, but it was a start. And for the first time, hope burned brighter than fear. The forest no longer glowed as brightly as before. The explosion had left its mark, with blackened debris scattered among the shimmering foliage. The hum of the machines was gone, replaced by a haunting stillness. Drew sat at the edge of the clearing, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. His breathing was slow and deliberate, but every muscle in his body ached, a constant reminder of how close they had come to death. Behind him, Taylor tended to Lyra and Kala, who sat huddled together on a patch of moss. The girls were quiet, their usual energy subdued by the weight of what they had just survived. Talea's golden hair shimmered faintly as she leaned over Kala, murmuring soft words in her native tongue. Drew couldn't hear what she was saying, but the gentleness in her tone told him enough. "Are they hurt?" he asked, his voice low. Taylor glanced up, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Just scared," she said. "They'll be all right." Drew nodded, exhaling slowly. "We bought ourselves some time. That's all we could do." Taylor straightened, her expression sharp. "Time isn't enough. You saw what was in those ruins. They won't stop." "We've weakened them," Drew said. "We've got a chance to plan." Taylor crossed her arms, her gaze hardening. "And what will you do when they send more? When their makers come looking for answers?" Drew frowned. "Makers?" Taylor hesitated, as if she had said too much. She sat down across from him, her voice quieter now. "The machines didn't build themselves. They were created for war, as I told you. But their creators, they might still exist." Drew's stomach tightened. "If they're out there, why haven't they come back?" "Maybe they abandoned them," Tala said. "Or maybe they're waiting for the machines to finish what they started." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Drew leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Then we need to find answers." "And how do you propose we do that?" Tila asked, her tone edged with skepticism. "We go to the source," Drew said, his voice steady. "We find out where the machines are coming from and stop it at the root." Taylor stared at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. "You're reckless. But maybe recklessness is what we need." The journey began the next morning. Drew led the way, using the map he had pieced together from the ruins' fragmented data. The trail took them deeper into the forest, where the trees grew taller and their bioluminescence dimmed. The air felt heavier here, thick with an unnatural stillness that made every sound echo louder than it should. Lyra and Kala stayed close to Taylor, their small hands clutching the edges of her tunic. Lyra's usual curiosity was tempered by caution, though she occasionally glanced at Drew with questions that never quite made it to her lips. "Why is it so quiet?" Kala asked softly, her voice barely audible. "The machines don't patrol this far," Taylor said. "They don't need to." Drew glanced over his shoulder. "What's out here that keeps them away?" Taylor's gaze shifted to the horizon. "The forest itself. It doesn't trust anyone." By midday, the group reached a massive chasm, its jagged edges plunging into darkness. Across the gap, Drew could see another structure, sleek, alien, and humming faintly with power. This was different from the ruins they had destroyed. This building was alive, its surface pulsating with energy. "That's it," Drew said, his voice quiet. "The source." Taylor frowned. "How do you know?" "Because it's guarded," Drew replied, pointing toward the base of the structure. Machines swarmed the area, their movements precise and methodical. Unlike the ones they had fought before, these were larger, more advanced, their metallic bodies gleaming with polished surfaces. "We can't fight them all," Tala said. "We won't have to," Drew replied. He pulled the salvage device from his pack, the same one Taylor had modified to disrupt the machine's cores. "This is our way in." "And if it doesn't work?" Taylor asked. "Then we improvise," Drew said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Taylor shook her head, but there was no anger in her expression this time, only resignation. Crossing the chasm was a challenge. Drew used vines to create a makeshift rope bridge, his movements careful as he secured it to the jagged edges. Once the bridge was complete, he motioned for the others to follow. Lyra went first, her small hands gripping the vines tightly as she moved across. Drew held his breath as she reached the other side, her feet landing safely on the solid ground. Kala followed, her face pale but determined. Taylor crossed last, her movements swift and deliberate. Once they were all across, Drew turned toward the structure. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll plant the device." "No," Taylor said. "We go together." Drew hesitated, then nodded. "Stay close." Inside the structure, the air was cold and sterile. The walls were lined with conduits that glowed faintly, their light casting eerie shadows. The hum here was different, more purposeful, as if the building itself was alive. Drew led the way, his knife in hand. Every step was careful, every movement deliberate. The machines patrolled the corridors in precise patterns, their red eyes scanning for intruders. They reached the core chamber without incident. The room was massive, its walls lined with glowing panels that pulsed in rhythmic waves. At the center of the room stood a towering device, its surface covered in intricate designs that seemed to shift and shimmer. "This is it," Drew said, pulling the device from his pack. "This is what we came for." Taylor stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the core. "It's beautiful and dangerous." Drew nodded, his hands moving quickly as he set the device in place. Sparks flew as he connected the wires, the hum of the building rising to a crescendo. Suddenly, the room shook. Alarms blared, their shrill tones cutting through the air. The machines were coming. "They know we're here," Taylor said, her voice urgent. "Just a little longer," Drew replied, his focus unshaken. The first machine burst into the room, its massive form blocking the entrance. Taylor raised her hands, her body glowing with an intense light. A surge of energy erupted from her palms, slamming into the machine and sending it crashing into the wall. Lyra and Kala huddled behind a console, their faces pale but determined. Lyra's voice was steady as she whispered to her sister, "Stay with me. We'll be okay." Drew connected the final wire, the device sparking violently as it activated. "It's done," he said, turning to the group. "We need to move. Now." The group sprinted through the corridors, the alarms growing louder with each step. Machines swarmed the building, their movements frantic as they tried to stop the intruders. Taylor unleashed bursts of light, her attacks precise but draining. They reached the exit just as the device detonated. A blinding flash of light consumed the building, the shockwave sending them tumbling to the ground. When Drew opened his eyes, the structure was gone. Only smoldering ruins remained, the hum finally silenced. Taylor knelt beside him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Drew replied, his voice hoarse. Lyra and Kala ran to him, their small arms wrapping around him tightly. For the first time since his arrival on the planet, Drew allowed himself to hope. "It's over," Taylor said softly. "For now," Drew replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But we're ready for whatever comes next." Together they stood in the ruins of the machine's stronghold, the light of a new dawn breaking through the trees. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a chance to rebuild, to fight for a future worth living. And for the first time, they believed it was possible.